At least for me, when we're here together. So, yeah, come on in, everybody. There's Gord, Dorothy. We'll just wait for Gord, and there's Rita to come on in. Yes, and you're welcome to have, coffee and goodies in here for our workshop today. So welcome to Caring for Our Future. So glad that you all, decided to come and take part in this today. It's our first one ever that we've tried. And so I'd like to introduce, first of all, the committee that put this together, because I kind of plopped the idea on them, and then they ran with it. So they did all the hard work. So we've got Paul at the back here. He's going to give a wave. Paul and Janet. Sorry, I'm like drawing a blank. Sandra, I know you're like maybe unofficially on the committee, but you get voluntold to do things. And yeah, who else is here from the committee? Dorothea, yes, and Diane. Thank you for putting all of this together. And we have a number of speakers, as you already know if you signed up, over a couple of different dates. So what's going to happen? Oh, I'll introduce myself in case you don't know who I am. I'm Pastor Trish. I'm one of the pastors here at Holy Spirit. And the other pastor is Pastor Lindsay Jorgensen-Skakem, who's back there checking out the snacks, making sure that you left some for them. And so just a couple of things. So we're going to get started right away. And with our first session, we've got 3 different kind of information sessions today. And one is from Serenity, Sam from Serenity. She's ready to go. Pastor Lindsay and I are going to lead you through, the church side of planning for a funeral. And then we're going to have Jill Burt come from the Hospice Society and talk to us about grief and things like that. There will be a little break time in between, so it's not going to be just solid sit in here and listen and learn. So we'll have a break time, but feel free to take a break whenever you need to. Go and refresh your coffee or water, get a few more snacks. The washrooms are through the double doors, and I would just also say sometimes when we're, engaging in conversation around, the end of life or death, it can bring up some different feelings for us, and it might be even unexpected. So if you just need a quiet moment to go take to yourself or in the library, or you need someone to talk to for a minute or pray with you, Pastor Lindsay and I are here. There's also others who can come alongside of you if something is kind of hitting you in a difficult way this afternoon. So with that, I think we'll welcome. Did you have any more to add, Paul? Thank you. Come on up. I'll get out of your way. Oops, sorry.
That's okay. Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome Serenity Funeral Services as the first session of our Caring for the Future workshop. Serenity Funeral Services is a community-owned, not-for-profit, full-service funeral homes. They run as a cooperative comprised of numerous churches of varying denominations. These churches elect an executive board that determines the direction and monitor the operations of Serenity Funeral Services. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sam Mann.
I've never felt so tall. My name is Sam. Can you hear me? Okay. I've been in the funeral industry for, I hate to say it, 24 years. I was 12 when I started. It was good. Today we're going to do something just a little bit different. I want your input. I want questions. I don't want to stand here and tell you things. I want to be able to look after each and every one of your questions. So through this little presentation, you're going to be given a card when you do ask a question. And then when we're finished here, you'll count the cards. And I've got a special surprise for you. The one with the most cards wins. So hopefully that will open up a little bit of conversation. So first of all, which one of us, who here, makes plans? We need some cards. Why do we make plans? Does anybody know why we make plans? What happens when we don't make plans? Yeah, we face uncertainty, anxiety, fear, stress, all of those things that are a little overwhelming. We see families on probably what is to be the worst day of their lives. That's the day when they lose a loved one. And sometimes the easiest questions will be the hardest ones to answer. So when a family comes into Serenity after a loss of a loved one, there's questions that we ask. These questions are so that we can register a death with the government. And those are your vital statistics, your name, your birth date, where you were born, what your mother's name was, what her maiden name was, where mom was born, dad's name, where he was born. Now, you and I know what our parents' names are. We, most of the time, know where they were born. But I guarantee you, my children walking into a funeral home, not knowing what to expect, wouldn't know. If they did know, they probably wouldn't be able to think about it. So we need to pass everyone out a card, because everyone put their hand up right at the very beginning. So how many people have heard about prearranged funerals? Oh, that's a 2-for card deal. How many people have a prearranged funeral? Can I ask you, why did you prearrange your funeral?
Make it easier for the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Don't mind repeating the answer so people watching later online can hear as well.
Repeating the answer. Oh, I got you. Okay. It makes it easier on families. Any other reason? You share it with the family. Absolutely. It also saves a lot of money. Remember, we were just talking about stress? So when we prearrange, everything is set. The prices never go up. I wish Safeway would have done this in the 80s when I was buying groceries, because I'd have bought groceries and bread, for instance. Your money goes into an insured trust account in your name. Now, years ago when I first started in the funeral industry, a lot of little funeral homes kept the money for prearrangement, which was very bad, because there were a lot of funeral homes that closed their doors and took a walk. Now, the Canadian government stepped in and said no more. That money has to go into a 100% insured trust account in your name, not the funeral home's name. So if Serenity ever disappeared for whatever reason, your money would be 100% guaranteed to be there. Also with Serenity, your prearrangements are transferable. Now, unfortunately, death doesn't always happen at home. And I've known that in my own family. So we also offer what we call travel insurance. Travel insurance, this sounds really funny, but I bought it for my son and my husband for Christmas last year. What do you buy your kids when they've got more than you do? And my son looked at this and he said, Mom, what am I going to do with this? He travels. He's actually a police officer, but he goes on these holidays wherever. And I said, if anything ever happens to you, son, I want you to be brought back. A lot of folks say, well, I'm going to Mexico, and if something happens to me there, I'll just be cremated there. No, I want you back here. The reason for that is there's an awful lot of expense. You're dealing with permits. You're dealing with the Canadian Embassy when you're in the States. You're dealing with all of the pain and torture trying to bring that person back, plus the expense. A lot of us, when we purchase travel insurance, I know my husband went to Arizona a couple years ago, and I bought him insurance, like just health insurance, because he has his travel protection. So if anything would have happened to him down there, it would have brought him right back. Also, if we go to BC and something happens to us, we never think about going to Saskatchewan and something happening. I mean, if something does happen, it brings you back. My aunt and uncle owned a place in California, and that sounds really nice, but I think it was just a trailer, I'll be honest with you. And they were driving, and I guess they went through a dust storm, and my aunt hit the back end of a big truck, killing my uncle instantly. And before they had left, I was pushing her, get this, Aunt Lois, get this. She did. They were absolutely amazing, because that's all these folks do. So and the cost of that is $525 for the rest of your life, anywhere in the world. There is some information in your pamphlet about that as well. Okay? So prearrangements. How do you pay for a prearrangement? It's simple. Whatever best suits your budget. When you decide to do your prearrangement, those prices are frozen. We break everything down so that at the time of your passing, everybody knows exactly what you have. There are no gray areas, because chances are I may not be there when you pass away, or if I am, I probably won't remember. So everything is broke down on a contract, and those prices are frozen. My husband and I did our prearrangements, I'm embarrassed to say, last summer, because we went back and forth with the kids. If we die, what would you want? What do you need? And they kept going, no, I don't want to talk about it. We'll look after it. It's okay. And I finally said, no, we're getting it done. So when I handed my son, who's our executor, our arrangements, he just looked at me and he said, thank you, Mom. Thanks for doing that. So we decided to go on a monthly payment plan. And the reason why we did that, first of all, I don't have that kind of money to put out right away. Second of all, it was far more convenient for our budget. And as soon as I put the first payment down, those prices are frozen. So they never, ever go up, no matter how long you live. Does anybody have any questions? No? I'm doing that good. So CPP, who's heard of the Canada Pension Plan Death Benefit? Cards. So the Canada Pension Plan Death Benefit is a one-time only payment. The maximum amount is $2,500. It has to be applied for after we pass away. So it is not there to pay for your funeral. It's also taxable income to the person that's passed away. So a lot of times I've had families say, no, I don't need to do the prearrangement. I don't have to pay for it because I get the CPP. Not necessarily. Sometimes we don't get the CPP. It depends on how much we've paid in. The maximum amount, like I said, is $2,500. So you've had to work for 9 years full-time and paid into it before you're even allowed to get that. So just to let you know that that death benefit is not there for your funeral. It takes 6 to 12 weeks to receive after you've applied. Okay? Life insurance. Who has life insurance? I'm keeping you busy. So life insurance is great. I'm happy folks have it. But it also may not be there for your arrangements at the time of your passing. Life insurance as well has to be applied for. A lot of times they need to know the cause of death. So therefore you have to contact your physician or the attending physician to fill out the paperwork. And that's sort of like pulling goat teeth. Sometimes they just don't want to give you that information. They're too busy. They don't have time. So I've had families that have had to wait for the life insurance until they can contact a physician to get the paperwork ready for life insurance. I've always said life insurance is for the living, and it truly is. I tell my families, do not rely on that at the time of a passing, because it can take a while to get those funds through. Anybody have any questions about life insurance? Yes.
Okay, so would you advise people who have credit card debt, mortgage debt, all that, to take the insurance that goes with that, like more in loans and mortgages, that in the event that they die, the debt gets paid back?
Yes, yes. And I see that every day. With Serenity, we're one of the only funeral homes. Well, I know we're not the only one, so that's not quite true. But we have what we call executor's choice. So after a passing, and I am going to answer your question with this, but after a passing, we have families come in that there's so much paperwork they don't know where to start. We look after almost everything. We do all of the applications for the Canada Pension Plan, death benefits, survivor's pension. We notify your driver's license. If you don't have a driver's license, you may have an ID card. We can cancel or transfer utilities, air miles, of all the things. Any pensions that you may be receiving, like your loved one may have been receiving, we can notify them of the passing. What else is there on there? There's such a long list of things, and it keeps going. But one of the things I see an awful lot are families that come in with, like you say, credit card debt. The first thing that I tell them, very first thing, is check to see if there isn't insurance on those credit cards. The second thing I tell them is you don't have to be in a rush to contact the bank. The bank is a business, no different than any other business. One of the things that I do tell families is to please contact the bank when you're ready. Ask to speak with an estate specialist, somebody who knows what they're doing. Do not go talk to a teller, and please do not take your loved one's name off of the bank account. Because if there's any funds at all coming in for the death benefit, for maybe your driver's license or your final income tax, you want to have an account open for that money to go into. If a teller, and this has happened, if a teller does happen to take the name off the bank account, close the account for the family, it's very difficult to open up another bank account for a deceased person. So just please keep that in mind, and this lady gets a card. The income. I don't know what income.
You were talking about income in terms of the time of death. Maybe it's just
No, the death benefit is at the time of a death. I'm not too sure what you're asking. Because when you pass away, if you're receiving your CPP and OAS, maybe this is what you're wondering. That stops. It's finished. And say you have a spouse And they used to call it the widow's pension, they now call it the survivor's pension. That would be about 60% of your CPP that your spouse would receive. Does that make sense to you? Is that what you were asking? Okay, I kind of figured. That's great. Yes?
Sir, could you just repeat, who are you supposed to speak to at the bank? State specialist?
Yeah, an estate specialist. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yes? I can't answer that, honestly. Every bank is different. Yeah, and they all have their own rules and regulations. There's different things that different banks require. I'm just going to touch on probate. I wasn't going to do this, but I can't help it. A lot of people come in and mom may have passed away and had no property, but she had sold her house and put the money in a bank account. And that's fine. But at certain different banks have a different amount that you can have in your accounts until probate kicks in. I know with TD Canada Trust, it's $30,000. The reason why I know that is because I was so angry a few years ago. A little lady, 97 years old, sold everything, gave everything to her kids, and had an account with $37,000. That was enough for that bank to freeze that account and put the estate into probate. CIBC, I know, is $50,000. The rest, I'm not sure of. 10? Wow. Yes.
I'm just a little confused. So if you've got $29,000 with TD, that account stays open?
It may. $30,000 is their benchmark.
So at 31,
Oh, you're going to probate.
you have to go to probate.
Yeah. So this is another good reason for prearranging. And I've seen this happen way too many times. A family will come in and they'll do the arrangements for their loved one. And then it comes time to pay. And maybe bank accounts are frozen because the bank has found out that person's passed away, so they freeze that bank account. A lot of times the money has to come from our children or our family. But that's not quite true either. The funeral home is always the first to get paid. All we do is have the families take the invoice from the funeral home to the bank, and they will pay for the funeral out of their loved one's estate.
Even if it's over the limit.
The funeral home bill.
No, the family will take, yeah. So when you hear people say, well, the mom's bank account was froze, so we had to take all of the money, and this happens because they don't know that the bank will pay if you take an invoice. So just know that. So probate is an actual forensic accounting of a person's estate, making sure that there's nobody out in the woodwork that's going to come in and say, Sam owed me X amount of dollars and I want that money. Excuse me. That's why you see in the newspaper notice to creditors and claimants. It's sort of like a speak now or forever hold your peace. When you see that announcement in the newspaper, you know that that estate is going through probate. So just touching on probate before I'm not getting right into it because I am not a lawyer. Okay? So is there any more questions about probate?
Just going back into the accounts, you have a joint account, is that mitigating the?
It may or may not. That's gray.
I'll just say we do have, like, our next session in October is David Tomsky is coming, who is a lawyer, to talk about estates and probate and all of that. So write your questions down. Some of them might be better for David.
I just have wanted to kind of open that up to you because I do see all the time families coming in that aren't quite prepared, don't know what has to happen after a loss or how to pay for a funeral when an account has been frozen. That's why I wanted to let you know that. Yes.
Sorry, it's just another probate question. On average, in Alberta, in a pretty straightforward case, how long does probate take?
It depends on how busy the courts are.
Oh, so
Yeah.
nothing to do with how horrible or
Nope.
nice the illness?
No, 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 absolutely not. Yeah, no worries. So let's get back to the funeral part of this, which I'm supposed to be doing. Have you ever thought about what it is that you had wanted for some of you that aren't prearranged? Have you, when I die, I want... Have you told anyone?
I've told my children, and actually, I want to, you all hear me? When my late husband died very suddenly, and we didn't expect this. He was in care at Grandview, and they phoned me. First of all, they were wonderful. They said, "Are you alone?" And my son was with me. And then they said to me, "So what did you want us to do with the body?" Like, have you made arrangements? And I hadn't. But a good friend of mine, his dad had died, and they had serenity. So that's what I said, and the whole experience was just wonderful.
Oh, you should get 2 cards.
And actually after, another wonderful thing was, they came to my house, they had all the papers, they helped me so much.
Yeah.
It was just wonderful. So thank you.
No, you're so welcome. I'll pass that along to everyone. That means a lot to us when we have families. Thank you. So, if death isn't always something that we can see coming. There's sudden deaths every day. I see families that have said, "Well, she wasn't supposed to go before me," or the worst one is, "I'm never supposed to lose a child. I'm always supposed to go before my children." Unfortunately, we can't a lot of times see something coming. So that's why, again, it's so important to be prepared to get information. In the packages that you received, there's my card in there. If you want to prearrange, wonderful. I am excited, happy to help you. But if you have questions, because that's my personal cell number on that card, I want you to feel free to call me if you have any questions. If I don't answer, it's because I'm with a family. I'll call you right back. So please. So different types of services. Let's talk about this. Cremation. We all know about cremation. There's 3 different types of cremation services available. The first one is where the body is actually present at the service. It gives families and friends time to say goodbye. A lot of people, seeing is believing, and that's how we get our closure. And then after the service, the cremation would take place. Okay? I generally will suggest to families to use a rental casket because there's no sense in buying a big fancy casket just for an hour or 2. I'll tell you, my dad passed away a few years ago. I lost my mom when I was 6. And my dad had cancer. He had all of his prearrangements done. And when he passed, my sister and I said, "You know what, we're okay without the viewing or visitation. We've been with him for the last couple weeks, so we don't need that." So anything that you prearrange And if you feel at the time of your passing, your loved ones feel at the time of your passing that that's not needed, because we never know how we're going to die. That money goes right back to the estate. The funeral home cannot keep that. So don't be afraid when you're doing your pre-arrangements to put down a viewing or visitation. There are a lot of families that need that closure. So the second type of a cremation service would be what they call a memorial service, where your cremated remains are usually placed in an urn of your choice, and then the service takes place. And generally there'd be a picture and maybe a DVD movie, or, you know, whatever it is that your family needs. Here I feel that you're all quite well taken care of and lucky that you've got the warm arms of your ministry around you. That makes a big difference. I see families a lot of time where they have nobody, they have nothing. You guys are like a family, and that's fantastic. So in saying that, with Serenity, we do reach out to our churches. We also offer amazing discounts for church members as well. So that would be offered to you at the time of your pre-arrangement. Now, the third type of a pre-arrangement or an arrangement is one I don't like, and I don't even like talking about it. That's when it's called a direct cremation. So at the time of your passing, we would pick you up from your place of death, bring you into our care. We do all of the government registration, documentation, and then the cremation takes place, and then your family's called to come and bring you into their care. A lot of people don't realize that their loved ones may be suffering, and I see this all the time when there's no service. I don't mind if they say, you know what, we're going to do something for Mom on our own. Great, whatever your choices are. But please do something. Have some sort of closure. It's so important for folks. I see families after a loss when there's been no service, and it's almost like they don't even know that that person's passed. It's because they haven't had that chance to say goodbye, that chance for closure. We're getting worse and worse with not having services. And I think the reason for that is because we don't want to be a bother. I really do. I used to be really bad with the kids at Christmas. I'd say, no, don't buy me anything, because I don't want to be a bother. And one year at Christmas, my son came with this candle, and he said, here, Mom. And you know what? I was taken back. I was so happy. And it made him feel good to give that to me. And so when my husband and I were doing our arrangements, I said to him, we need to do something. We need to have some sort of a closure with our church, with the kids, as a community. That's what we need. And so when we did our arrangements, we do have a viewing or visitation. If the kids want it, they can have it. If they don't have to. We also have a memorial service afterwards. So things do change. We don't know. We can't always say, when I die, I'm going to do this, this, and this. So with the pre-arrangements, just know that things can be changed. They're not written in stone, absolute, because we change, our wishes change, our families change, our thoughts change. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Remember when my late husband died, we had prearranged, and as we went through everything afterwards, I thought, well, I really don't need this anymore. And yeah, it all went, whatever cost was attributed to that went into his care.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's something I want to share with you. When I first started in the funeral industry, if I seen 100 families, I would say probably 45 of them would have prearranged. It was a hard job. Now, if I see 100 families, I'd say 80 of them would prearrange. The reason why people are doing this, not only does it save money, it saves a lot of purchasing out of grief, out of maybe all different types of feelings. When a family comes in and we ask them if there's been a prearrangement in place, you can almost see the relief in them when they say yes. When you get a family that comes in and there has been no pre-planning in place, they don't know where to begin. When we do a prearrangement, I try to do everything I possibly can. I gather your vital statistics, some of those easy questions that are difficult. We'll go through the different types of services that you may want. If there is going to be a viewing or visitation, do you need a rental casket, or do you want just a small viewing in the funeral home where the rental casket wouldn't be needed? And then once we get everything done, everything is locked into place. If something changes or you have any questions, it can be changed, like we said.
This might be something you may be answering, but in terms of your burial, whether you're in a casket or cremated, you can pre-purchase your plot.
Correct. Absolutely.
That's part of the pre-arrangement.
No. Serenity does not own any cemetery. So what I suggest to families is if you go on the City of Edmonton website, there's a lot of beautiful cemeteries in the area. You can even take virtual tours of a lot of these cemeteries. And a lot of times their prices are down on them, on the cost for the plots. So with cemeteries, you don't just purchase the plot. You may have to pay for the opening and closing of the plot. For an earth burial, 99.9% of cemeteries in Alberta are now requiring what they call a vault. A vault goes into the grave, the casket goes into the vault, and then the vault is sealed. Now, a lot of people say, why a vault? Like, what's that about? Well, we use heavy equipment now to open and close graves. And when you go across a grave and you put your backhoe arms down, if there's no vault, that grave can sink. I know when my mom died in 1971, my dad had to go continuously for the next few years and fill that grave. What a horrible thing to have to do. With the vault, that stops that from happening. The earth is tamped down on top of the grave that will not move. It also saves headstones from tipping over as well, the vaults. Some cemeteries will require what they call just a cement liner, others an actual vault. So when you're purchasing cemetery property, make sure that you ask, is a vault required, or am I okay with a cemetery or a cement liner?
What's the difference? Vault and liner.
Okay, hang on. So a liner is just a cement liner that goes in to the grave. It's not sealed. There is a lid on it. A vault is literally a sealed compartment. They're made at Wilbert Vault here on the west end of the city. If you ever get a chance, go in there, take a tour. It's really, I know it sounds a little nerdy of me, but it's really quite interesting how they make these things. It's a science all on its own, and they're constantly being tested. Even the cement that they use is stronger than the cement that's in our basements. So you know they're there forever. Yes.
In regards to cremation, do you have to bury the earth?
No, a lot of people, they'll either purchase a plot for their urn or maybe a columbarium. It's like a wall, and it's got compartments in it where the urns can go. More and more people are scattering, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not real fond of that either. When you're scattered, there's nothing. It's like you didn't even exist. That's my own personal opinion. There's no place for your loved ones to go. A columbarium, and it's full of niches.
Yeah, I think I've seen, at a couple cemeteries, I've seen those. And another question, if, you have previous family that are buried, in caskets, and then one of your loved ones pass away after and are cremated,
That depends on
it depends, can you be buried like on top of the
Not
casket?
all cemeteries.
Depends on the
It
cemetery.
depends on the cemetery.
Can you divide the cremains to scatter and put in a?
Absolutely you can.
Could you repeat that question?
Can you divide the cremated remains? Absolutely. There's also little keepsakes that families, or necklaces, things like that some folks really like to have, and that's great. Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Can you, review your pre-planned?
Absolutely. And I strongly suggest everybody does that every few years. Review your pre-arrangements, because, like I said before, things change, we change. Sometimes it's just nice to know that what we have is still what we want. Absolutely. It's just looking after things, keeping current.
So we just phone?
Just phone the funeral home, yeah, and just say, listen, I'd like to talk to Sam. I want to review my pre-arrangements, whichever funeral home you go to, and they'll book an appointment and go in and just revisit everything. See if everything you have is still what you want. See if everything that you have is something that your family would still be in need of, or maybe there's something different. Because the funeral industry is changing constantly. There's more and more and more things coming. So there may be something new that you go, you know what, I think I kind of like that, maybe instead of that. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So we have prepaid plots, in other words, we have plots, but they're in a different city. So would you advise that and we decide we want to be here, despite the fact that at one time we want to be there, would you advise having that done prior to our demise?
Like,
Okay, so we have prepaid like we bought plots 40 years ago in Calgary. And I know that company can transfer them to Edmonton. So in other words, my question is, we should probably have that done.
yes, do your due diligence. Absolutely. Contact the cemetery and say, you know what, we are no longer there. That's another problem. A lot of people, and I mean, my dad did the same thing when my mom passed. He purchased plots and then he decided he wanted to be cremated. Well, I'm not going back to Grand Prairie. My home and my life is here. So before he passed away, we actually sold the plots. So, and that they made it quite easy for us because those plots were really well wanted. But yes, do your due diligence. A lot of times people will purchase plots and, like yourself, move and forget about it or not even tell families. Yes.
I know one thing some younger generations are thinking about, I'm a younger
Thanks,
generation
hon.
here, is green burials or eco-friendly burials. And I just heard something from Edmonton at the Northern Lights Cemetery is kind of starting this new eco-burial kind of where you're cremated or not, but your body returns to the earth more quickly. But there's also stone markers of so-and-so is buried here, but it's more kind of a natural
Yeah.
land. And you know, how many people are you seeing that kind of want that direction versus more traditional directions?
I usually do a pre-arrangement for a green burial about once a week or once every second week. It's getting more and more because we don't want to be a nuisance to the environment. So what green burial is your body is placed either in a shroud or in a biodegradable casket. It's made out of wood and the liner is with cotton. You cannot be embalmed. So if there's going to be a viewing or visitation, it's going to happen quickly because our bodies break down extremely quick. And most of those, they'll have the burial prior to the service. They'll meet at the cemetery for like a little graveside service with just family and friends, and then hopefully have a service for everyone else after that. But yes, green burials are becoming more and more recognized as well. More cemeteries are starting to say, okay. But keep in mind, for a green burial, there's not a vault either. Your body goes directly into the grave. Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I almost would guess. Like through even the outlying areas, a lot of times, like Spruce Grove, Leduc, Devon, that kind of thing, their plots may be a lot less expensive than the ones in the city, but they're getting more and more picky about who they're letting in. You have to almost become, or you have to be a resident of those communities in order to take advantage of the cemetery property.
I know we have one on our property, on the farm, basically too. So I was just wondering, I haven't got a clue, basically. I've never really asked or anything else sort of thing, but I know every now and then I see a new plot, people buried there sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing with scattering cremated remains. It used to be such a no-no, and now it's becoming more and more acceptable. Before you couldn't scatter over public parks or in running water. But now it's a little more accessible. There are spots that you can. I know for a fact in some of the lakes that are surrounding Edmonton, there's probably more cremated remains there than there is in the cemeteries because that's where the person wanted to be. Yeah. I don't like it, like I said, because it doesn't give you a place to go. It's like you were there. I lost a sister a few years ago to leukemia, and her husband scattered her in the mountains. And it's like she's gone. That's it. Like I said, I know where my mom is, and I know where my dad is. So that's something, and it's an irreversible process. And I've had families through the years that have said, well, you know what, my brother went and scattered Mom, and we're not too sure what, where. And that can be very difficult, very difficult.
And the flip side of that, I know people who say, fine, you're scattered, it's over.
You're right. Yep. Absolutely.
And their ancestors used to own the farm, and they want to scatter on the farm. Hey, he said, I don't know where you scatter them or where you go, just do it.
Oh my.
So I came back in an hour or so, had a bottle of wine, and that was it. You know, but I mean, if people do different things for
Yeah,
different reasons.
absolutely.
In regards to the vote thing, to me, that's, why? My father read out, said, I want a tree root to grow right through my heart. No vote, I want to be natural, so.
Well, the funeral homes weren't the ones that have insisted on vaults.
To me, that's, I mean, sorry, that's, we're all gonna rot anyway, so it's gonna vote or the vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody's different. We all have our own wants, our own wishes. So what I strongly, strongly advise everyone to do, if you don't want to do your pre-arrangements for whatever reasons you may have, a lot of folks are afraid to come into the funeral home because they're scared that they may have to buy something that they really don't want, or that they're going to be kind of coerced into buying things. Serenity, we do not work like that. I guarantee you we don't. Come in, phone. We're happy to give you information. We're happy to answer your or your questions, whatever you may have. Everybody's an individual, and we all have our own wants and wishes. So by putting it down on paper does help your family an awful lot. It takes away, like I said, some of the feelings of we love mom so much, we have to buy her the copper casket. And I have seen that happen. I have. And it's very, very sad, because I don't think that's what mom would have wanted. Another thing that happens a lot of times is people will put their wishes in their will. Is that a good place to put your no? Why? Why not?
Well, it just depends where the will is, because as I got the phone call, what did you want us to do with the body? I didn't have, it was in the safety deposit box. This was at midnight, I got the call, right?
Well, and a will is generally not read until after. And I'll tell you all a little story about a lady I looked after here not too long ago. They had went and they'd picked out cemetery property for mom, and then mom passed away, and lo and behold, they got a hold of mom's will, and she wanted to be buried, not cremated. It's an irreversible process. So she was left sitting with that thought of, oh no, I didn't do the right thing for my mom, which can be very difficult, especially when you're going through that loss and that grief. So please be very clear and black and white as to what your wishes are for your family. Yes?
Sometimes the executors should be aware of what's going on as well.
Absolutely. So your executor does have to know. It's important to know where everything is, because when we do that paperwork afterwards as well, it's good for them to know. I know my family was very secretive about where everything was, where all their papers were. It was like, don't tell anyone. Well, people need to know, because when you pass away, there you're going. What I always ask families before they come in to visit me, please bring a copy of the will, because for the death benefit, they want to see the first and last page of that will, and bring that person's wallet. I feel creepy asking for it, but there's information in there that you wouldn't have anywhere else. Things like your Blue Cross, your driver's license, maybe your credit cards, your wildlife identification tag, things like that. So absolutely be very open with your executor and let them know. They've got a hard job ahead of them. Okay, yes.
Well, I know when I work in law, you, as with wills, you always gave the people who were doing their wills a copy of the
Yes.
will, which they are to give to their executor, and if they wish, to their family. If one of
Correct.
their family members is the executor.
Right.
Because, like you say, you need to know when you get that phone call.
That's right. That's right. And even if a death occurs, your funeral director will ask, is there a will? And the reason why they ask that is because they want to know that they're speaking with the right person. We have people that have said, I'm the personal director, or I'm the power of attorney, or I'm the enduring power of attorney. That all stops after you pass away. That's when we need to talk to the executor. Okay? Yes.
Maybe a silly question, but how complicated is it if you make your arrangements in one province and you end up living in another one?
Transfer them.
Just transfer them?
Absolutely. Probably about once every 2 weeks, I do a transfer from BC or to BC. Because us as Albertans, when we get older, we want warm weather. So we go to BC, and then we get to BC and we go, why did we come here? All of the kids are still in Alberta. So we move back. It's not an issue at all. Because don't forget, your money's sitting in a trust account in your name. That is your money. You can do with it whatever you want, wherever you want. If you've got your pre-arrangements in BC and you say, you know what, Sam, I want them here, all I ask you to do is bring in a copy of your pre-arrangements, or I can contact that funeral home and have them transferred. Okay? So don't be afraid to protect your family by doing a pre-arrangement. There is no trouble you can get into. I've had families that have come up to me, and this, I still want to cry when I think about it, that will give me a hug and say, thank you so much for making mom or dad do that. I've never made anybody do it, but whatever they think, I'll take the hug. Okay. All right. So your next speaker is here? Oh, okay. Excellent. I'm happy. Does anybody have any questions about burial or cremation? Yes. Well, it all depends on the casket that you choose. So for cremation, everyone thinks you have to purchase an urn. Oh, thanks. You don't have to purchase an urn from the funeral home. We like it when you do, of course, but a lot of people will come in with their own urn, and that's fine. I've seen some beautiful homemade urns. But for cremation, one thing that is required by law is you have to have what they call a cremation container, which is a container that your body goes into for the actual act of cremation. Now, if there's not going to be a viewing or visitation, I always suggest to go with the least expensive one because nobody's going to see it. It's for government regulation. Now, as far as embalming, there is no law in Alberta that says you have to be embalmed. I know that I've had families come in and say, well, you know, this funeral home or that person said that I had to be embalmed. That's not true. And I think what it is a lot of times we go on Google or we get asking questions maybe to somebody who may not understand or has had a different experience elsewhere. But even for earth burial, you do not have to be embalmed. Embalming is preservation and sanitation of our body. When there's going to be a viewing or visitation, I strongly suggest embalming or else have the viewing quite quickly. The reason is our bodies do break down very rapidly. And you don't want the last memory to be a bad one. You want it to be a good one. So,
So if you didn't have embalming and you wanted that quick viewing, are funeral homes actually able to accommodate that?
absolutely. Yeah.
I just know that sometimes when you're actually working a memorial service, even for a funeral home, you sometimes have to wait many days.
Okay, so what happens when we pass away and our body's brought, say it's for cremation? We have to have approval from the medical examiner to go ahead with the cremation. And the medical examiner usually isn't open on the weekends. But that does not stop your family from being able to come and see you. What we would do is we would lay you, if there's to be no embalming or anything, we would lay you restfully on a table, clothed, and with a blanket over top of you, and they can come in and see you. You do not have to be embalmed. If there's going to be viewing or visitation, I suggest making it swift. Because you are right, sometimes it does take a few days before we can do, after we register the cremation and get the go-ahead from the medical examiner to actually do the process.
Are there cases where cremation is not allowed then?
No,
No?
no, I don't think so.
Oh, it's okay.
I don't think I've heard, yes.
Just one really teeny kind of comment. If you're gonna be cremated or planning on cremation and you have a medical device, please let whoever's doing the cremation know, because some of them don't do well.
So things like a pacemaker. When a person comes into our care, we know right away whether they have a pacemaker or not. You can tell. Absolutely, pacemakers have batteries, and they do not go well in the crematorium.
What are the rules with regards to having to notify a medical examiner? Have they changed?
Okay, so anything happens. If I went home tonight and I passed away, don't call the funeral home, even though you have your prearrangements. Always, always 911. 911 all the time. So if I went home and I passed away, because the funeral home can't pick you up without a signed medical or the proper paperwork. So if I went home and I passed away tonight, my husband would have to call 911. And then from there, because why did she die? I would go to the medical examiners. Nobody dies. I don't care if you're 110 years old. Nobody dies for no reason. There always is a reason. And that's what the medical examiner's job is. The only time you do not go to the medical examiner is if you have been under the doctor's care 2 weeks previous to your passing. So please remember, folks, always keep yourself safe. 911. Yes, sir.
In regards to Ingrid's question over here, could you be a little more specific? Like exactly what kind of a ballpark you're looking at?
Oh, as far as costs, like I said, it depends on if it's burial, depends on the casket. It also depends on the cemetery, whether,
But the parameters, you know, like, say, is it between 5 and 10 or 20 or 30,000?
oh no,
Something, I know it all varies, but
yeah.
basically, she says you didn't answer the question.
Basically, cardboard casket dropped in the ground. I don't want
Don't have a cardboard casket.
so much. That's the basic.
You're probably looking around 4,000. Yeah, around that. I apologize. But like I said, it all depends on the casket. There's so many different things it depends on. Yeah.
So basic, bottom line,
Yeah.
death,
It would be, so, and that would be without embalming or anything like that.
very basic,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And cremation?
It depends on what type of cremation. Would it be a direct cremation? Now, folks, you have to understand, there's so many variables. What type of urn, what type of cremation container, what type of casket. I don't want to stand here and tell you it's going to cost you $2,000 when I don't know. I don't know what type of casket or urn or, yeah. But you also receive church discounts as well, so we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I'll tell you why it comes up with me. My husband and I are, neither of us have our pre-planned. And his mom passed away 2 years ago, and for a fairly straightforward, simple thing, they spent almost $15,000, which
Yeah,
I thought was crazy.
it's crazy,
But she had nothing pre-planned.
right?
So that was the first thing. The second thing is that if I plan to make an appointment to talk to you, I would kind of like to know beforehand, am I talking like a
No,
$10,000 hit?
no.
Or am I talking a $30,000
Yeah,
hit?
yeah, no.
Because I'll put it off as, if it's 30,000, I'm gonna put it off as long as
I don't blame you. I would too. I wouldn't want to talk to me for 30,000.
I understand, but you know, it's one of those things, you know, it's like writing a check for CRA, you know, you just don't wanna do it.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? It's something that it's like writing a will. We always think, oh, well, we got time. We'll maybe do it next month, or, you know, and then all of a sudden something happens, and guess what? We're out of time.
It's not any different buying a car, you can buy a Volkswagen or a Cadillac.
You're 100% right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
In the Serenity, you at chapel there,
On the north.
get together and things of this.
We do on the north side. On the south side, we don't. But we do have a viewing or visitation room there that families can gather to say their final goodbyes. 91st Street. Yeah, 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 yeah. And with Serenity, because people are getting more savvy, people are wanting to know, like yourselves, how much and where is my money going, and do I have to have this, or do I? That's why a lot of people are also doing their prearranging, because they want to know that everything's covered. They want to know that everything's looked after. And that's why, like I said, years ago, out of 100 people, and now compared to 24 years ago, people are just saying, you know what, I'm getting this done. It's like I said, it's like writing a will. It's something it's easy to put off. I think one of the biggest things is sometimes we know we're all going to die, but it's never going to happen to me. I can't answer that. Yeah, because we don't have cemetery. I don't know. Like I said, go on the City of Edmonton website, and you'll probably find a lot of different prices. Yeah, for sure.
I know our daughter passed away when we lived in Calgary, and she was
Oh,
my mother-in-law's headspace.
right.
So she was still small enough that.
Yeah. Aw. Yeah, that's difficult. That's
Something as we move through life, it's something to consider.
Yeah, a lot of times with cemeteries as well, and I've heard this happening. Mom or dad may have been buried in ABC cemetery, and then the kids want to be placed in the same grave. Some cemeteries will let you bury 6 cremated remains, or maybe even only 2. But a lot of times with a lot of these older graves, you have to have permission from family members in order to do it. And trying to find some of those family members can be exhausting. So yeah, it can be difficult, that's for sure. Yes.
One thing from kind of an officiant side of funerals or liturgist is also when you're doing pre-planning, depending on when you do pass away, it's at different points of your life. So if you're young, you know, we've had funerals here where we can't get enough seats.
Right.
For someone who's quite young who's passed away, in other families when they're in their 90s, close to 100. You know, it's close family, friends, but a lot of that community has passed away unless they're a church member, and some people want to come.
Mm-hmm.
So there's those aspects too of planning, you know, for maybe one point in your life when you're thinking there's going to be a crowd here, it's going to be really busy, we need this much catering, versus then saying to family, you know, who's going to be there, what are we planning for, and what does this look like?
Right.
funerals that are quite large.
Right.
If it's a smaller family funeral, we can often deal with it in-house with our own people.
Right, absolutely. And you know what? We appreciate that as well. Um, I I hear from a lot of older people, well, no, I'm not going to have a funeral because all my friends are dead. I hear this all the time. It's so true. And unfortunately, they're not thinking that about their children. And their children have friends that want to come and support them. So I've seen the smallest little funeral services turn into a huge service. And, overwhelming, maybe not huge, but very overwhelming for the family. And I always think to myself, I'll bet your mom's up there smiling down, thinking, I'm so happy everyone came, And like I said, we all have our own way of saying goodbye. And with your church family here, which is amazing support, please feel lucky for that. There's a lot of folks out there that don't have that support. Give yourself some time to think about prearranging if you haven't. Sit down with your children or your spouse, and if you have any questions, call me. I may not be able to give you the answers on the price because, like I said, I don't want to tell you it's $4,000 and then you come and it's 35 or 45. That's kind of a gray area for me. But take the time, get the information, even if you do call, and you want to do your prearrangements, or you want information, does not mean that you have to sign on the dotted line. Okay? And I thank you so much. Can we count cards? If I make it. Thank you again, folks, for having me. Really appreciate it. And I hope. Oh, thank you.
Thank you card for you as well.
Thank you.
And we're breaking for coffee now, I do believe, on the schedule here. So,
All right, let's settle in. Okay, for our next discussion, we're going to get the pastoral perspective on funerals. So I get to introduce some of my favorite people, Pastor Lindsay and Pastor Trish. They're going to help us, lead us through what it's like to be part of a funeral and organizing that, because that can be hard at the time when you didn't have any plans, because we don't usually plan for this sort of thing. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, in case you don't, I'm Pastor Trish. We're not often confused. I mean, we are often confused, but I mean mixed up, the two of us.
We're the same height right now.
We're the same height right now, thank you. Yes. Okay, so we'll repeat questions or pass the mic.
If you have a question, I'll run the mic to you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to go over today. You should have a handout that looks like this and a fancy brochure that looks like this. You're welcome to take both of those home. And please ask questions if you have questions. And even, of course, we can't cover everything today. I think you all know where to find us if you have questions or wanted to pre-plan this part, of caring for your future. So, yeah, so what do you think is the point of a Christian funeral, memorial service? For the survivors, Gord said. Sorry? Yeah.
Closure. Yeah.
Closure.
Wrapping it all up.
Wrapping it all up. Uh-huh. The end.
Renewed faith, Ted said. Renewed
faith, yeah. So those are all perfectly great reasons, absolutely. But as you'll see on the handout here, we can just read this. A funeral or memorial service is one that reminds us of God's place in our lives. We proclaim the promises of hope and love for all God's people. It's a special time to remind one another, of God's promises to us after death. So it's really a worship service, So it's really an opportunity for us to give thanks and praise to God, and giving thanks for that life that's been shared with us. And we proclaim the promises that we hear like every Sunday or when you're reading scripture, all kinds of different ways, but a funeral service is a very particular time that we would hear those promises. And as Sam said, making these kind of final preparations is really an act of love or an expression of love for our families, that they don't have to guess and draw lots to see who's going to get their way when they're planning a service for us. And Pastor Lindsay and I have both sat down with families, and you ask them, something about maybe what they would like. Like, would you like to have, what kind of music would you like? And they go, yeah, they don't know. What kind of readings would they like? They don't know. So, it really is an important expression of your faith, even to do that pre-planning work. So we're here all the time, right, to help you in that, and just to get you through that. Now, just a really quick little liturgy overview. If you want to grab one of the red hymnals, I know we don't use these very often, and turn at the front part to page 279.
The little numbers.
Yeah, little numbers on the bottom. We'll just do a really brief overview of this, because we do want to leave lots of time for you to have some little conversations and to ask questions. So 279. So actually there's a little explanation paragraph there at the beginning that talks about, from a liturgy perspective, what the point of a funeral is. But we begin with this gathering. And so a gathering is like a welcome statement in the service, and it's meant to sort of set the context of why we are getting together. It is to celebrate this person's life, but it is to praise God. And of course, when we come together, it's so that we can support each other in those difficult times. Then typically in a Christian service, there's a time of a thanksgiving for baptism. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, because most people that are having a burial in the church have been baptized. And then we go into a greeting, prayer of the day. Is this starting to sound a little bit like a Sunday morning? Prayer of the day, scripture readings, and then a sermon, which is, I know Pastor Lindsay preaches about 45 minutes at a funeral.
Not at all.
No.
5 to 8 minutes max.
There you go. We would make a profession of faith in a creed. It's often the Apostles' Creed, which is kind of known as a baptismal creed. It's the one that's professed when a person is baptized. And then we would have prayers of intercession. I kind of like to say that, even at a funeral, when, it's kind of a very intimate time, we do still have prayers for the church and for the world and for other people in need, because we do want to remember that there is a whole world out there that needs our prayers. Now, if we were going to have, as you see at the bottom of page 282, if we were going to have communion at your funeral service, that's where we would have it, is right after the prayers. And then in the time of the communion liturgy is when we would have the Lord's Prayer. And then the final part is a sending, or called a commendation. A commendation is sort of like a final blessing for that person. But you know what? Actually, the service isn't even over right then. Does anybody know when the service actually is concluded? That's right. Yes. So I always say that the graveside part of the service, it's like a continuation, is made for Canadian winters or Canadian summers when it's 39 degrees, because they're very short. But the real reason why they're short is because it's a continuation of this, right? So this is, generally short, would be 45 minutes, average is maybe an hour. Could be a little bit longer in some cases. But the graveside part is like literally no more than 10 minutes, because it's a continuation of this liturgy. And so we're going to talk about little pieces that can be inserted in here, things that you're probably already used to, like eulogies and words of remembrance, things like that. So, Pastor Lindsay, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Pastor Trish. So an important part of planning a funeral, you'll see on the back side, we have some fill in the blanks that will invite you to work towards with us today, and you can continue working on at home. But choosing choosing readings can sometimes be a daunting task. Some of us have traditional readings that we would say, well, of course, at my funeral, what psalm do you think might be read? 23, yeah, the Lord is my shepherd. That was on the tip of everyone's tongues. But did you know you can choose other readings?
What?
Of course, we want you to choose the readings that feel best for you, most meaningful for you. We never turn down someone when they say, we want Psalm 23. But what we suggest is thinking about what Bible readings, what Bible stories have been important for you in your life. What stories, readings, wisdom have brought you hope? What stories, readings, teachings of Jesus and the promises of God do you want proclaimed to your family in the midst of their grief? So that means some families have done a very traditional route. You probably know this one from John also. My house has many rooms. Where I go, you will go also. Very traditional funeral text from the Gospel of John. Some people have had readings from what I might call more our Christmas season. So Mary's song. For a mother in her 90s we had once, proclaiming what it means to care for the world, to the cares that the mother still wanted for the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. These passages that maybe, stump your pastor when it's written down saying, oh, I want the feeding of the 5,000 because I really loved preparing food for my family, or those big family dinners. And so that's the other important part of choosing readings, is not just to say this was important to me, but to name why. Why was this such a crucial story for you? So what I'm going to invite you to do now, and you don't have to know what it is, but turn to a neighbor if there's a little group around you, and maybe share some of your favorite Bible stories.
You don't have to commit to it at this
No,
point.
no, don't have to commit. Just what are some of your favorite Bible stories? Pastor Trish, do you have a favorite Bible story
Well,
that
I have
either funeral or not you would want involved?
Yeah, I have a few. One of my favorite ones is the healing of the blind man, where the parents are like, oh, yeah, he was born blind, but I don't know how he got his sight back. It's like this comedic routine to me. So that one, the raising of Lazarus, is a favorite one of mine for sure, and many others, yeah.
So the nice thing about this is there's no wrong answer. You can choose any reading, any important story, and that would be welcome. And as you notice on the back, there's actually spots for 4 readings. Typically, we choose a gospel lesson, a psalm, and a reading from the Second Testament and from the First Testament. What we say outside of this is if there's other readings, poems, things that are important. I've had, teachers who have said, I read Tuck Everlasting to every class, and so I want this paragraph read from this book because it's really important to me. Of course we would say, yes, how do we fit that in? Or a special poem that your grandchildren have written for you. Yes, how do we fit that in? So know that we're open to other sources, other things, but it's important for us to ground part of our worship service in Scripture. So I'll invite you in small groups, whether it's just a pair or a group of 3, you're kind of churning around to see who's near you. Discuss some of your favorite Bible readings and why you might choose those, even if it's Psalm 23. I really want that because... All right, I'll give you 5 minutes. Talk to people around you. And if you have questions, hey, where's this in the Bible, Pastor? We'll come to you. I'll give you 1 more minute just to wrap up your beautiful conversations and we'll come back together. All right, coming back together. Just raise your hand if you have a story that you came up. Maybe you were surprised you had one. What was one you thought of? A Bible story, a reading, something that might be important. I heard lots of chatter. Who's going to be brave? The prodigal son. Thank you, Janet. Very cool. Yeah. The burning bush.
Wow.
Okay. So the story towards the end of the Good Friday narrative of Christ on the cross and forgiving the criminals on either side and hope for those who may not know Christ. Yes, wonderful. Anyone else want to share? I heard great conversation. And what I want to say is if you're unsure, this is the part you get to come and say to Pastor Trish and I, let's talk about what's important to me of faith. Name for us, what does faith mean to you? What does this promise of God mean for you? And we can help you come up with those passages and say, in our Rolodex of Bible stories, well, does this fit? Because that's kind of what we do if we have a family come to us and they describe their loved one's life, if we don't know them, or if we're lucky enough to have them in the congregation saying, oh, given their life, given their story, this text seems to fit. So no, you don't have to have the perfect answers, and they can change. It's just something important to be thinking about. All right, next up, you're going to want your little tiny folder here. This is our pre-planning funeral booklet. And if you go inside, we're going to talk about music. There's some hymn choices there that we generally say, these work well for funerals. Does this mean this is the be-all, end-all list of what you can have? No. So for some people, it's really important to have congregational singing at their funerals. But for some people, they say, you know, I'm kind of the last one that's been going to church, and I don't think it's fair to have congregational singing in this way for a whole bunch of songs. So instead, I want instrumental music, like a pianist playing, or there's this secular song that's really important to me. We did a funeral a while back for a family who had lost a child, and the mother wanted a song from Pink. Now, you may not think of the artist Pink and funerals, but it was very meaningful. It really fit with the theme of where the family was at, the emotions, and it was very powerful. So if you come to us and say, I want Stairway to Heaven, we will just say, tell me why, and how does that fit in? I'm not saying you all have to have Stairway to Heaven. I'm just saying this is the questions we need to be asking ourselves. What's important? And the best way to do this, honestly, is be here on Sundays, watch services on Sundays, and as we're singing hymns, if there's one you really love for one message, a lyric, how it sounds, write that hymn number down. Maybe this is one I want. If you have a name that hymn tune, Pastor Trish and I are pretty good at that when you're like, we can be like, oh, Jesus Christ is risen today. Good. But we're open to things. So can you sing a Christmas song at a funeral? Yeah, middle of July, why not? Does it fit with the funeral? Sure. So there's no hymn that's off limits as long as it makes sense with what we're planning today. Yes, Ted. Oh, for sure. We've had some families that have said the Hallelujah Chorus is really important to me. Of course, we can't get the choir trained in the Hallelujah Chorus and have them there in a week's time, but we've had people play songs off of YouTube that we play throughout the sanctuary before or after or during the service. So you can see on the planning sheet, depending on if you have communion, if it's just a regular service, there's a number of slots you can choose songs for. I think generally we would say 3 songs, 3 hymns, 3 musical breaks, so to speak, help with the flow of the service. Of course, we can work in more or special music. If you have people in your family that play an instrument or want a musical offering, a soloist, we always welcome those things. Corolla. I would say here at Holy Spirit, I have not seen the choir involved in a funeral other than attending, but members could be approached to do a solo or lead singing if need be. Any thoughts on music? Do any of you have a favorite hymn that you want sung at your funeral that's off the top of your head? Sandra? Here I am, Lord. Beautiful. Yes. Borning Cry. I was waiting for Borning Cry. That's a great one. That's a great one. How great thou art. Thank you. A Mighty Fortress. Very Lutheran of you. Yes. Theologically sound. Yep.
I like that soon and very soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Harriet said soon and very soon. I once had sorry, Paul, I once had a family wanted to play Led Zeppelin songs in the service. So I asked them, the why, and they told me the why. And I can't remember what the song was now. So we did play it, and then I preached on it because I looked at the lyrics, and I thought, well, this is important to them, so we'll build on it. We'll build on it. They weren't a church family, but
Yep.
anyway, Paul, sorry.
Oh, Prayer of St. Francis. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Abide with me. Beautiful.
If some of you had came a few years ago to Sam Bradford's funeral, he had picked his readings, and not only had he picked his readings, but his daughter had given us these reflections that he had written on the readings. So it made, I think I was preaching that time, it made my job very easy, and it made the service very personable then, right? And it was also a wonderful proclamation of God's presence in his life that he still got to express even at that time. Yeah.
Great. I'll pass it back over to Pastor Trish, but again, on a Sunday, if you hear a song that you really love, write that down. Put it in a note in your phone, Ted.
When you talk about 3 hymns, is there any particular one more important at the beginning or the middle or the end? Or
That's part of the wonderful planning Pastor Trish or I could do with you in the midst of this, that we can kind of say, this sounds like a hymn that'd be good to enter to, or this fits well with the reading of the day you've chosen. And I guess that gets to another point, that even if you're planning this funeral with Pastor Trish or I, it would be kept on records here at Holy Spirit. So even if you've planned the funeral with us, or you planned a funeral years ago with someone else here, as Lutherans, we understand as members of a church that whoever is the pastor then will look after the pastoral needs of the family at that time. So let's say you planned a funeral with myself or Pastor Trish, and God forbid, 100 years from now you die. We're probably not going to be here at that point in time, but your records will still be here. Whoever is in the care of this congregation will still be here, and they can plan and carry out your funeral as it's been planned. So that's the other important part of telling your families, hey, there's pre-planning done with Serenity or with whoever, but also the church has on file my service. And oftentimes Serenity or other funeral homes will say, great, bring us back that service so we have a copy too, just in case the church loses it. But today, digitally, we'd probably send you a copy yourself, and you can share it with families.
Sometimes families have said, I was at this funeral and they had this song, or they had this reading, or my husband had this reading, and then they want the same thing. That's no problem at all. If it was something that, resonated with you, like Pastor Lindsay said earlier, or I think even Sam said earlier, like just write it down so that you don't lose it, right, and forget about it. And then just to touch on, so Pastor Lindsay and I, either one of us, if something happened to you, when something happens, either one of us could plan the service with you. We don't hold on to either that I always preach or Lindsay always preaches, but we ask the family, like, do you have a preference? And we're really okay with whatever that preference is. The one thing, though, I would say, I'll just add to that, we can also do a service somewhere else. It doesn't have to be here. It could be, sometimes if the weather's good, we've done a service right at the graveside. It's maybe a little bit shorter. We've done them at a funeral home, sometimes even in somebody's home, so it can be elsewhere. In the church, though, we don't usually allow like an outside pastor to come. So sometimes, not from our own members, but we might get a phone call from somebody saying, hey, can I come and use your church for a funeral? Well, no, we don't just use a church for a funeral. So we have called pastors here, and it's part of relationship building and all of those things. So when there's a service here, it's either at this point in time, Pastor Lindsay or I. We do have, there's exceptions to that. Next Friday, we do have a funeral that we're extending some grace and hospitality to Ansgar Lutheran Church to hold a funeral here, simply because they don't have the size. So their pastor at that time will be leading that service. But it's kind of a understood practice amongst pastors for that. Yeah. Any other questions for the moment? Rita?
How often do families want communion during the service?
Oh, yeah, that is, as Sam was saying, it's more and more pre-planning. I find it's less and less communion. And so that's a question on your sheet to be thinking about. What about Holy Communion? What about a remembrance of baptism? So sometimes what I hear families say when I'm working with them, and I'm sure Pastor Lindsay's had this too, is, well, not a lot of the people who are coming are not church people. My family isn't church people. I don't want them to feel awkward. And yet we all know that God works in wonderful and mysterious ways, and you are a church person. So if you think that's important, I would strongly encourage it. It is one of the most wonderful proclamations of God's love and care and providence and promise for us. And, you know, if people, we do our best to make it very inviting, but also not kind of arm twisting if we do have it in a service that people would still feel comfortable to just stay in their seats if they don't want to have it. So it is something to think about. You know, why would I have it? Is it important to me? Is it important to my family? Yeah, but, you know, as a pastor to another Christian person, I would encourage it. I will have communion at my service. Well, I won't have it, but
Yeah.
somebody will be eating and drinking.
Ted, go right ahead.
Question, in terms of communion, would it be all right to have it like in the evening before the service, usually family getting together and sort of ceremonies?
Like at a viewing or a little private, you could.
The next day's service, having communion at that time for the family members.
You could do it that way. You could do it that way. I think I'd want to just talk a little bit about, you know, we don't want to kind of ever privatize Holy Communion, right? It is a public sacrament and a public proclamation. So it doesn't mean you can't do it that way. You sure could, but it's just a consideration as to whether you want to include it in your service or not. Yeah. And do you want to talk about the remembrance of baptism? Sorry, Darlene.
Well, you know, my thought on that is, you know, like, really, does it matter if other people are uncomfortable? Because my sense is, and there's lots of times Jesus made people very uncomfortable. So why would we walk any differently than he did?
So Darlene said, you know, some people might feel uncomfortable, but Jesus often made people uncomfortable. Yeah. But it also, we hope that they would experience some grace or something wonderful, right?
I think here at Holy Spirit, we have such an open practice for communion as compared to many, even other Lutheran churches. We don't say, are you deserving? We just say, come as you feel welcome. And we have members who have been here for many years who never come up for communion. That is their choice. I've had atheists come up and receive communion. I don't know what it means for them, but for them it's meaningful. I'm not here to judge. I'm just here to give God's love through the sacrament. So we've only, I think, had one funeral that I recall since being here, almost 7+ years, 2 years on top of that, so 9. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't even think of really the percentage, but
Not many,
Not
but
many.
I know our altar guild, well, it is kind of on top of their usual load, would be happy to take on that. I'm sure I'm seeing nods from the members of the altar guild who are here saying, yes, of course we would figure that out. So that's one aspect. The other aspect we often lift up for people is a remembrance of baptism. And Harriet, you're someone who's often said that's really important for you in the midst of some funerals you've seen where we remember God's promises and we pour water into the font and we lift it up and saying, this is the hope of what God has proclaimed, not just for our beloved who has died, but for all of us gathered here. It's kind of a moment of remembering God's promise of life and love, and that we're never taken out of God's care, and creation is never out of God's care, which is a really wonderful way to ground our service. So that happens near the beginning of our service, one of the first things we do, really. And so that's open to anyone who's been baptized as a way of remembering, and it's just a nice symbol. Yeah.
Sometimes the remembrance of baptism could also include the giving of a candle to the family as well, including the symbol of water. So there's lots of things we can do like that. And even in the liturgy itself, I mean, we can incorporate all kinds of things that are meaningful. So, we kind of have our typical order of the liturgy, right? And the X number of readings or hymns. But it doesn't mean it has to always be that formula, right? We can personalize it. And I think this is where the advantages of giving some pre-thought to it, like you are today, is you can talk with your family and you can say, well, what's important to you? What's meaningful to you? And what's going to, I think it's, to me, it would be thinking of what is going to help my family kind of navigate that time of grief, right? Sometimes the very traditional things are what help us. You know, they feel solid, they feel like a foundation, they've been around forever, we've heard them before, and so it feels safe and secure, right? And sometimes we want something completely different and new. And like, just as an example, this list of hymns for our repertoire of music here, it doesn't have any of our contemporary hymns of inclusion. Like, one of my new favorites is that one, like, for everyone born, a place at the table. Like, I love that song and the inclusion of it. So we probably have a wider range of musical familiarity here than some other churches would, or even praise and worship songs too. It's all a matter of, can we get the music sometimes? Yes.
Janet.
When you were saying liturgy, like when I'm thinking of liturgy, I'm, thinking, the response and all. So do people choose, like right now our services are like the Canadian liturgy or the different ones that we used to read. So is that what you're referring to? Like you can choose specific things like that? Or not necessarily?
Well, yes, you could. So liturgy generally means like the order of the service. So, but those pieces, if you wanted to have something that looked a little more like a Sunday and including like a gospel acclamation like we sing, certainly we could include those things as well, yeah.
And sometimes us pastors are the most problem makers when it comes to planning a funeral because we've done so many. So for mine, it's hold an evening prayer, and I want it at night. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you can do things that are out of the box, but that just means taking some planning and explaining to your family why. Yeah. So there's why is this funeral at 7 o'clock? I don't want to hold a candle. Get this out of here.
I've also heard of people, not very often, but of having like their funeral in the midst of a Sunday worship. That, it was within that liturgy of the whole community. And there was a small part in there, like maybe it was the sermon and a few prayers, that was the ability of the whole community then to say a farewell and remember that person. So there's lots of different ways we can do this.
Kind of the same idea as having a wedding in the middle of it.
Yes, and I've heard of that too. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you probably all are well aware that there's often a time of remembering from family or friends, right? A eulogy, words of remembrance, it's sometimes called. Just a little note on that is when we give a sermon or a homily at a funeral service, we don't eulogize the person. So it's not our job to talk about their life and all the good things they did and their career, all of those things. Our job in giving a sermon is to proclaim Christ. So that doesn't mean it's taboo for us to mention their name or connect a gospel or a scripture reading to their life and why it's important. But we focus on proclamation of the word. So it's the job of family or loved ones to then bring words of remembrance. So as you heard, it's usually called it's usually called a eulogy. So sometimes we get questions about that, and people will say, well, we have somebody who's going to give a eulogy, but then we'd like to have other people speak. And we say, that's totally fine. You can have other people come and do that. But we don't want that to then envelop the service or overtake the service. So we kind of say, maybe there's the eulogy, maybe a couple other brief speeches or remembrances. We really kind of discourage something that people sometimes ask, could we have like an open mic? And we kind of go, no.
Save that for the reception.
Save it for the reception, because you just never know, how long that could go on. And you kind of have it's a bit about good hospitality, right? You don't want to have a captive audience that people start going like this, and it's like we're hearing story after story. So it's part of just having a well-planned and respectful service that we discourage that and refer it to the luncheon afterwards. So a eulogy typically would kind of give the factual pieces of their life, what they did in their career, their family, maybe if they immigrated from somewhere, all of those kinds of pieces. And it could also include some stories, right? Funny stories. It could include sad stories, transformational stories, important parts of their life, sad times of their life. But it doesn't have to be their whole life, right? You can never encapsulate all of that. We'd be here for a long, long time. So generally we say, keep it respectful. We never want to really have stories that kind of denigrate the person or are disrespectful of them. And, maybe looking at sort of 10 minutes, maybe no more than 15. And if you had more speakers, it's like, now let's try to squish them into 15. Maybe no more than 20 minutes would be long. And that's my opinion, right? The other piece is, as you know, it's more and more common now to have like a PowerPoint slideshow or some kind of video of the person's life. And I think this is where the pre-planning part could get really helpful. Because imagine in the midst of somebody passing away, you're not only going to go talk to Sam and get all of those arrangements made, now you got to talk to Pastor Lindsay or I, now you got to find all these pictures for a video. It's like, I often say it's like planning a wedding in a week. So it's a lot of work and a lot of things to think about, and unfortunately, sometimes you just don't have the time to think through things well. So you could do that ahead of time, right? So a video of some kind, I have literally sat in a funeral service that a video was 35 minutes long. And it's not that it's the time that I thought was not helpful. It was that the pictures repeated. It would be like the same Christmas service, or it's like the family in front of a Christmas tree, the family in front of a Christmas tree, it's like you could kind of start to hear people go, and so it wasn't, in a sense, very hospitable to the people who were there. So just thinking that through a little bit, what are the pictures that really capture the essence of that person's life and relationships? And again, there's no possible way we can grasp it all, right? So kind of a general rule of thumb I say to families is no more than 3 songs. So rather than a time limit, I say, if you got 3 songs, that would be, 2 songs or 3, that's enough. You're just trying to give a taste, right? Just bring up people's memories of that person. And then there's lots of time to talk afterwards when you're sitting over, a plate of goodies and a cup of coffee. And even that's not the end, right? You can go and visit later and talk about those favorite times as they come back to mind. So questions about that, Darlene?
So what I'm hearing with video is to keep it short, like say 5 to 8 minutes.
That's right.
The reason why you would keep it like that, but do it before the actual funeral service gets started, and then you don't,
Great question.
and then you don't play it through the service.
Yes.
But you could keep
Yes.
it at the end.
So this is another thing that we sometimes suggest to families. It also helps to shorten the service a bit, right? So generally the liturgy with 3 songs is probably about 45 minutes. What makes it longer is the eulogies and the video. So if you get somebody talks for 20 minutes and then you have a 15-minute video, right? Now you can see where we're going. So if you had a longer set of pictures you wanted to show, yes, it could be playing beforehand. It could be playing in the hall afterwards. Absolutely, that's appropriate. And then it's really not part of the liturgy anyway. And so that's another way to incorporate it if you had a longer set of things that you wanted to include.
I mean, the reason I brought it up is I've been to funeral services that I've had it both ways, and it seemed to me that people actually paid more attention. That's maybe not the right word, but were more engaged in looking at those pictures while they're waiting to
Yeah. So, pay attention to that. Maybe if you are unfortunately going to a service in the next while, do they have a video? Where did they place it? Like, we often place the eulogies at the beginning of the service, because we find that people are often quite, if you're not used to public speaking, now it's an emotional time as well. Like, it's really difficult to sit there in the service and being worried about, oh, I got to get up here and say this. So we tell the families we do it at the beginning of the service so you can get it over with, and then you can just sit and, not that you relax, but you can just participate in the service then and don't have to be worried that that's coming up.
It also frames it really well to then
That's
say,
right.
this is who we're here to remember in the
That's
midst
right.
of this.
Yeah.
Ted, and then.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
So I think we would talk with a family about all of those pieces, right? If you want all these pieces in, it's then just the awareness, okay, now we're looking at an hour and a half service. So some people are okay with that. And some people then, okay, well, let's talk about what are the pieces we can, move around or take out and to make it for what you need it to be. Corolla?
I've seen the video played in the most recent funeral that we went to afterwards during the coffee time, and that I found helpful because there were lots of things in the pictures that I didn't either recognize or things like that, but I happened to have one of the daughters standing beside me, and she gave me all the skinny.
Good,
It was,
good.
And in the coffee time, the chit chat was appropriate.
Yeah.
In church, I don't know that it would be.
Yeah. The other thing you can do, like, you don't have to have a video, right? So the other thing lots of families do is they'll have a table, right, with photos, maybe some little trinkets or mementos that were, you always remember when you went to grandma's house and there was this little, whatever, a teacup or something, I don't know. Signs of what was important in their life. Maybe they collected watches or worked for the Boys and Girls Club. So that, you can put those things out on a table as well. Yeah.
I know we're approaching our time and wanting to be welcoming of our next wonderful presenter. You know where to find us. This
Yeah.
is work we continue to do, so we invite you to take this lovely homework home. You could even borrow a hymnal. Just let us know. You can take a hymnal home with you. Book in a time, though, I would say. This isn't a call us, kind of like Sam said, but book in a time with us to have an appointment saying, I want to pre-plan my funeral. And I did one of these with a member who was housebound, and we met for a few times for about an hour's length saying, okay, let's talk about the readings. Let's talk about the music. Let's talk about how you want to be eulogized, who might share these things. So, it could be done in one meeting. It could be done over the course of a couple, but we're here with you, and we'd be honored to help plan a funeral service that fits well for you and for your family. And the last thing I would say is that with the pastors of your congregation, it's not just, sure, you have a funeral that you feel good about, but it's also care of your family. So something that might come up in the midst of our conversations are, how is your family? Are there relationships that are strained? Are there things you want us to know about your family as we're caring for them, as you're no longer here? Are there things that we might want to be careful about naming or knowing? Or these aspects help us care for your family. We can write those notes. They're confidential alongside the planning we've done, just so we're aware of there's some issues between siblings. There's someone who's been estranged, but if they come, I'd want them to be welcomed. And what does that look like? So we're here to care for you, but also for your families.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pastor Trish and Pastor Lindsay, thank you so much. And on behalf of the ministry committee, we all got gung-ho, I thought, and another mayor thought, so we both did. There's 2 cards, so you each get a card. 2 cards, yeah, thank you for your time. Oh, you got. Okay, sorry, I got. So our next presenter is Jill Burt, who is the manager of Grief and Spiritual Support Services at Pilgrim's Hospice Society. And she's going to speak to us about grief and bereavement. And as you probably know, the name hospice is usually related to people that are experiencing a terminal illness or palliative illness, but I'm sure all these things we can hear about will apply to anyone going through grief. So welcome, Jill. And Jill, I think Anton here has your presentation, so you could either use
Perfect. Thank you.
And just so you know, Jill, that great guy over there, he's the one running.
Okay.
The
Thank you. I'll give you the nod. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you to Janet for inviting me, and thank you to Trish and Lindsay for inviting me into their congregation. It's a beautiful church. I've never been in here before, and I'm glad to be with you for the next just a half hour, 45 minutes or so, and I look forward to my time with you. And just a little bit of introduction about myself. My name is Jill, and I am the manager of the grief and spiritual support services at Pilgrim's Hospice. But I'm just curious, have any of you visited Pilgrim's Hospice? Does anyone know where it is? I'm just going to tell you right off the bat where it is. You've been there? Okay. Pilgrim's Hospice is in Crestwood. If you've ever been to Candy Cane Lane, Pilgrim's Hospice is right at the end of Candy Cane Lane. And I'm proud to be representing them today, and privileged to be invited here. My specialty, so I'm a chaplain. I'm a spiritual health practitioner. I'm working as the manager of the grief services at Pilgrim's Hospice, as well as doing spiritual care at Pilgrim's. And so the first little part of my presentation, I want to talk about grief. And you can go ahead and, well, there we go. And you know what? When you look at this, there's going to be a lot of words up there. And if you can't see it or you don't want to read it, I'm going to go over some of it. So don't worry about, having to follow along on this PowerPoint, because that can be really boring. And so I want to just talk today about grief and about Pilgrim's Hospice. At Pilgrim's Hospice, we have a very robust program about grief and bereavement. And why do we do that? Why is that a part of our program? What we really want to do at Pilgrim's Hospice is build a compassionate community for people who are grieving and experiencing loss and the incredible impact that has. And I think it's fair to say that none of us get through life without some sort of grief and loss in our lives. What we do at Pilgrim's Hospice is provide a safe place for the exploration of that as a griever, and we provide education and opportunity really to grapple with the grief and loss that we all experience at some point in our lives. We provide a place where really we can learn about our own journey through grief and loss, because sometimes it's a really difficult conversation to have. We're not really wired to just have these conversations about grief and loss. And culturally, they're sometimes difficult for us to have. So Pilgrims is committed to doing that. Really, we enable the participant to discover their own inner resources. And then we also talk about what other resources are out there when you are experiencing grief and bereavement. We support our clients to help understand the reality of their loss. For those of us who've experienced loss, which is all of us, there's so many different aspects to it. And today in just this little presentation, we're going to talk about some different kinds of loss and how we get through some of those things. What are some of the misconceptions? And these are some of the things that we do at Pilgrim's Hospice. So first of all, I just want to talk about what is grief. if you all close your eyes and I ask you that question, okay, what is grief? You would all probably have a different answer. And some of you would go, I don't even know how to explain it. But grief is everything that we think, feel, or need after a loved one dies. Now that's talking about the passing of somebody. Grief is also not just about someone dying. Grief can be about things dying, things changing, abilities disappearing. So grief is not just about someone that you love passing away. It's so much more than that. Grief is our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, how we act. Grief is an instinctual response to loss. So that means, we can't say, oh, now I'm going to have grief. Grief is very instinctual. It's what happens. It's what you feel when you experience loss. Grief is universal. And I think it's very fair to say that everyone experiences grief. It doesn't matter what age you are, what your religion is, what your background is, what your culture is. Grief is a universal experience. But in saying that, we all experience it, but every one of you, everyone sitting here today is going to experience grief in a different way. So your grief is different from my grief, and my grief is different from your grief. So you can't just say, oh, this is what grief looks like. No, it's absolutely different. And for every person, it looks different. So next slide. Knowing that there are different types of grief will really help us to determine what's happening inside of ourselves. So grief affects us not just in our head or our heart, but it affects us a whole bunch of different ways. And that's what I just want to take a minute and tell you about, because sometimes we don't really acknowledge this and these different kinds of grief. So very, very quickly, so the first one, normal grief. Like, I hesitate to use that word normal, but it's kind of the grief that maybe we're most familiar with. So this is the reaction that we have when we experience loss. And so we have really, really strong emotions at first, and then gradually, possibly, things become a little bit easier to navigate. So that's a normal grief reaction. Eventually, that person who experiences that loss will go back to some sort of way that they were previously. So that's a normal grief reaction. And again, it's not just the death of somebody, but it can be the loss of a friendship, the loss of a job, loss of ability, financial security, health. So there's many different things that you can lose and experience normal grief. The next kind of grief that is quite interesting is something that we call anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the grief that is felt in our hearts before the loss actually happens. So there are many different ways and times that we can experience anticipatory grief. And when you think about it, what happens the minute that you perhaps have a cancer diagnosis, or you hear the word cancer? What happens in your mind? Right. Things start to change immediately, and you start thinking, what now, what next, time frame, what's going to happen? And so we start to experience grief like right off the bat. There's also another time that we often experience anticipatory grief, and that's sometimes when there's something like dementia that happens. We start to, that person might still be living, right? They're still alive, but we have lost our ability to have maybe that relationship with them, those conversations. And so anticipatory grief is the kind of grief that happens when we grieve something before a separation, a death happens. The person feels anxiety, concern for the dying person, imagines their death, and looks ahead of the actual death. It does not reduce the grief then that happens when that person dies. So you can have anticipatory grief. Someone someone that you love might be dying of cancer, and then there's a death, and then there's another kind of grief that happens after that. Anticipatory grief can be really, really difficult because people might say things like, oh, well, that person's, enjoy the days that you have with them, that person, or at least they're still alive. And sometimes anticipatory grief is really not acknowledged. So anticipatory grief can be very difficult. The next one, so does that make sense? And at the end, we'll have, if you got some questions, just jot them down and we'll talk about them at the end. But the next one, a different kind of grief is complicated grief. This is sometimes a grief that we experience when things are complicated. They're complicated by relationships or situations. And this grief is often shown by just really, real difficult in the weeks following a loss, because they may feel so many different things, bitter and numb. And sometimes those reactions are just because of the complication of the grief. And sometimes that grief might be complicated because of situational things. You're grieving somebody who's far away from you, or it's complicated because perhaps there have been numerous deaths all in a row, or it can be complicated because of family situations. So complicated grief often shows itself in the form of a very difficult to navigate physically, emotionally, spiritually, and that's what we call complicated grief. And I'm going to talk about the normalcy of this, and I'm going to say it right now. These are all normal reactions. These are all normal. Anticipatory grief, normal grief, complicated grief. I'm going to go on with a few more of them. They're all normal grief reactions. And with each one of those, there are different ways to move through that grief. Sometimes with complicated grief, there's professional help that maybe needs to take place because it's complicated. It sometimes needs a professional to help unearth what's going on. Another kind of grief is sudden loss, and that is a profound kind of grief that happens. And as you sit here, maybe you have all at some point experienced that sudden loss where it completely surprises you and takes your breath away and is almost unimaginable to bear. Sudden loss, usually the reaction of the person who's experiencing that sudden loss is just shock, disbelief. Your mind cannot fathom what has just happened. Sometimes in sudden loss, it takes a while for the body to sort of catch up with the reality of what happened. You might keep going back to the fact that, I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe that just happened, because it's so shocking. Depending on that kind of loss, again, a modality of working through that might needing to be to do some trauma work. And I don't like to throw that word trauma out very much, but with sudden loss, it is a traumatic experience often to our head and our heart and our body. The next one is disenfranchised grief. So Disenfranchised grief is an interesting kind of grief. Grief can, again, it's because you've lost something. It can be a person, it can be, again, that job, the ability, relationship, finances. And disenfranchised grief is not really always socially acceptable. A person feels disenfranchised grief when their loss is really not accepted by society. Examples. My dog dies, and people are like, oh, I hate dogs. I like cats better, right? Or my cat dies. No, I'm a dog person. I don't, oh, you'll get another one. The SPCA has a bunch, right? And that can be devastating. That's a kind of grief that people just don't understand. It's not something that we really feel like we can really talk about. Death by suicide sometimes also carries a stigma. And so that is a disenfranchised kind of grief, where sometimes we have a hard time explaining or showing our grief, and socially people have a hard time accepting that. A disability, all of a sudden you might have a loss of mobility or something like that. I remember when my dad all of a sudden, he had Parkinson's and he couldn't drive. And this was, many years ago, and perhaps I was early on my journey of understanding grief. And my dad was sad and miserable about not being able to drive. And it makes me sad now to think that I was not very accepting of his grief. And in fact, I was like, you know what, you're fine. You got all these buddies of yours who'll gladly drive you around, and mom can drive you, and you shouldn't be driving anyway, and the car's getting old, and blah, 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 blah. And I never accepted his grief that was this disenfranchised grief. I had a hard time accepting that. And how I wish I could go back and just, understand that that was a loss for him. And I didn't understand that. Another kind of loss is these secondary losses. So in grief, there's so many secondary losses that many different kinds of loss bring to us. So, thinking about losing a partner, we grieve the loss of a spouse that maybe we've been married to for decades or years, but then we realize that there are secondary losses. I've lost my hope for, next winter in Arizona. I've lost my hope for the way that the person took care of the financial part of our relationship. I've lost the ability to have my partner sit at the kitchen table with me. So secondary losses, if you've ever lost a child, all of a sudden the secondary losses are your family doesn't look like what you thought it was going to look like. You don't have the grandchildren that you thought that you might have. So secondary losses, again, are a little bit like the disenfranchised one in that sometimes people don't really see that. But as a griever, they are often exponential and they carry on, right? That secondary loss, it's like, oh yeah, now I've lost that. I've lost that, and I've lost that. And those are a part of grief that is important to discuss and to be able to verbalize and to acknowledge and accept. Anniversary grief, another one. We often talk about that first year after a loss, after a job's disappeared or the dogs died. And we sometimes, there's a misconception that we're going to talk about a little bit later where we think, we go from the loss and we get back to normal over here. But there's these things called anniversaries. And, you're probably all sitting there remembering maybe a loss that you had several years ago. And you might remember that date. And when that date comes up, again, it's a little disenfranchised because people are like, oh, gosh, that was years ago. You're still thinking about that? And it's like, oh yeah, right now you're all probably have a date in your mind. And that is an anniversary date. And anniversary grief is a real and often, again, unacknowledged kind of grief. So I wanted to tell you all of those just to recognize that there's different kinds of grief. And there are different reasons, different things that we've grieved. And so in speaking about that, hopefully that just expands our capacity to understand ourselves and understand others as well. I want to talk just a little bit next about the physical grief and loss reactions. So when you when we first have grief that happens to us and we receive news or we experience something or a loss comes to light, there are so many different reactions that happen within our body. And again, I think it's important to recognize these. So, because sometimes we feel like, am I like losing my mind? Like, what is happening here with me? How, am I doing poorly? We often hear that, oh, how's Bob doing? And we say, oh, you know what, maybe Bob's not doing that great. The fact is that Bob is doing as expected, normally during his grief. And these are some of the things that are a normal reaction. You might have pain. All of a sudden my back hurts, my head aches. How many of you have been in grief and you have a pounding headache, right? Your stomach aches. Oh, I think I'm going to be sick, right? Normal reaction. Pounding heart, dizzy, short, difficult breathing, changes in appetite. Half of us will say, bring me a bag of Oreo cookies. I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to eat them all. And the other half of you will go, nope. I can't eat. I can't do it. Changes in sleep, sleeping a lot, sleeping a little, anxious, restless, absent-minded, brain fog. How many of you just, and I am curious about this, I'd like to see your hand, when you've experienced, when you're in grief, when you've had a loss and all of a sudden you can't remember if you said that or if you just thought you said it. Anybody ever? And we call that brain fog, okay? So it seems to be like a fairly normal reaction, right? In one of my times of grief, I would look at the coffee pot and I'd think, I don't know how to make coffee right now. I don't think I can. And that's a normal part of loss. Low energy, even things, physiological things like hair loss. So when we see someone who is in grief and they're experiencing some of these things and we think, oh, yeah, Bob's not doing good because, he's sleeping all the time. What we need to know is that Bob has normal grief. This is a normal grief reaction. Now, we can get into all sorts of things, what is the timeline on that? And we probably won't go there, but these are normal reactions. I'm going to just quickly go through some of these. So those are some of the physical ones that we talked about, but what about the emotional responses to grief? What do they look like? Disbelief. I can't believe that just happened, right? Crying is an emotional response. Relief, and we put this in here because it is a normal reaction sometimes in grief to feel relief. Especially if we journeyed with someone who's had a long journey through a life-limiting illness, and we feel a sense of relief. It's very hard to talk about, though. Not very often can we say, I feel relieved. But it is a normal emotional reaction. Sometimes we have nightmares and dreams, and sometimes we want to just pull away because our mind is so full. We just need some time on our own. Sometimes we want to tell the story over and over and over and over and over again. And that's a normal reaction. And sometimes we feel anxious and even panicked, especially if there's been a child loss. Sometimes we just are worried about our other children. Those are normal emotional responses to grief. Psychological, these ones, we'll go to the next slide. There we go. So sometimes we feel guilt. Oh, if I had only done that. Did I miss something? What if I had not gone out to grocery shop that day? What did I miss? Did I miss something? What if I had seen something 2 weeks earlier or a month earlier? And irrational thoughts. Yeah, there's different irrational thoughts that we can have that are, again, psychological grief responses. Bargaining, especially, I could have put this one under spiritual, but you know what? God, if you just let me get through this, I'll tithe more. I don't know what it might be, but there's often we do this thing where we bargain. We bargain with the divine. We bargain with God. And again, that sometimes is a normal reaction. Lack of concentration, which kind of goes back to brain fog. Self-absorbed, you just shrink and all you can think about is yourself. Lack of confidence, unable to make decisions. For those, this one really struck out to me. My goodness, in times of grief, I couldn't make a decision. I couldn't. And that's the hard part when we're talking about, I loved this pre-planning part, because I have sat with families and tried to help them. I'm a funeral celebrant, trying to help them decide how we were going to honor their person. And I could just see the cloud in their eyes thinking, I can't decide. I don't know. Which hymn? I don't know. I can't even. They're still in shock. So a normal reaction. Unable to make decisions, depression. Because grief is sad. And so again, but we see people say, oh, you know what, he's really depressed, he's not doing well. Grief is sad, and it can be depressing. And so we need to acknowledge these things and normalize them. And then there's also not allowing yourself to experience the emotions. What does that sound like? Hey, Bob, how you doing in your grief? And you say, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. And not allowing yourself to have those reactions. And again, it's normal. It is a normal thing. These are all things that we may experience. Next slide, social grief and loss reactions. We feel lonely. We feel isolated. We have change in relationships. And I think that we've all experienced that. Sometimes we think that the people who are going to be there with us during our grief and loss journey, maybe they just fade off over here. But yet there's someone from over here that comes along beside us and supports us and comes alongside us in that journey through grief. And that, again, is a normal thing. Next slide, talking about the spiritual grief and loss reactions. And sometimes we see loss of faith. It's like, I believed this my whole life. And, I prayed that God would save that person and they died. And, that sort of statement sometimes is just one of different things that we sometimes hear. Where was God? That existential question. Where was God in all of this? And sometimes it leads to a loss of faith. Sometimes the opposite happens. There's this opening, like, where is God? Thank you, God, for being involved in this. And that is a different, sort of on the different end of the grief and loss spectrum. Feeling of connection with those who have died, just this real connection with this person who died. Something that has this beautiful existential feeling to it. Asking questions, often like, why? Why did this happen? Why him? Why me? Why them? Why us? Why now? Why? What is the meaning of this all? What now? And sometimes what we also see is a new discovery of faith and spirituality after a loss happens. A deeper dive into a religious traditions, spirituality exploration. And so those are the head, the heart, the mind, the body. Those are all different reactions to grief and loss. And they're all normal. And they all, you may, pick some of them out that you feel that you've experienced, and others might be foreign to you. But wherever you are in that, they are all normal feelings that we experience after grief. There's also then lots of myths. There we go. You know what? And so, this whole thing like the top 10 things that, aren't true about grief. Well, I don't know how many I've got up here, but here's some of the myths. That time heals all wounds. That, and you've probably had, and people are lovely. I build my life on the story and relationships, but sometimes we just don't know what to say. And maybe some of you have had somebody say to you, oh, you know what, time heals all wounds. And you know what, it's actually not true. Now, our wound is maybe going to, it's kind of like, I get a cut on my hand. It's nasty for a while. Eventually it heals over, and I end up maybe with a scar. Grief is a little bit like that. I'm probably going to be able to always feel where that was. So I'm not going to heal from it. Healing to me means it's gone, right? I'm all better. I'm back to normal. Here's the reality. We're probably not going back to normal. Normal, whatever normal was, we're not, because we've had a significant loss. Avoid the pain, it's like, oh, just keep yourself busy. How many times have maybe you've been in grief and somebody said, you know what, just keep busy, you'll be fine. What project can we give you to do? Or, dragging you out to do something with us, because we know that sometimes avoiding the pain or diving into our grief requires sitting still for a while. There was a book written a long time ago, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it was probably one of these books that was mistaken, but it talked about the path through grief. And there was some sort of consideration that it is linear, that you have denial, and then you're going to be angry, and then you're going to do some bargaining, and then you're going to be depressed, and then you're going to accept loss. But that's not the truth. Grief does not, all of a sudden you have a loss here, and there's the thought that, you're going to end up over here and everything's going to be normal, but that's not so. These things, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. I often think my grandma was a knitter or crocheter, and as a kid I was always enthralled by the skein of wool, right? It went this way, then it went that way, then it went this way. And actually that's kind of what I think grief looks like. Sometimes it's acceptance, sometimes it's denial, sometimes it's angry, and there's no set path through this. It is not linear. It is a tangled web sometimes. Crying makes grief worse. I don't know who ever said that, but crying is, I'm so glad that God, the good Lord, gave us the ability to cry, because I honestly feel like tears are, such an important part of our grief. You have to be strong. Maybe some of you have been told that. You have to be strong. Be strong. It's like, really? I don't want to be strong. I can't be strong. And you're making me feel guilty now that you tell me that I have to be strong. So, yeah, no, you don't have to be strong. Depression and grief are the same thing. And I could do a whole seminar about that. And I'm not a psychologist, but, grief is a normal reaction. And depression is, we can get down. Clinical depression is actually something different. We won't get into talking about that. I want to talk about the truths of grief. And this one, are we up there? Yeah, truths about grief. Moving through stages of grief is not linear, and I just talked about that. No, it's a tangled web sometimes, so, enjoy the journey because sometimes it's a good day, and sometimes it's a day that is really sad, and maybe you're angry, and maybe you have more good days than you do days that are sad, and that's normal. Anyone at any age can experience grief. Kids are great at grieving, quite frankly. If any of you have worked with children are quite good at being mad, sad, glad, happy, angry, forgiving. They're quite good at that if we give them the space to do that. Anyone can grieve at any age. Truths about grief, it actually can be really quite harmful to push all those feelings down because, there's that phrase, the body keeps score, right? You need to be able to experience and express your grief because sometimes if you don't, it's going to show up somewhere at some time. Grief does not just occur to a death. We've kind of talked about that. Job, relationships, pets, abilities, hopes, and dreams. And this is the truth about grief, is that really you are not alone. Sometimes it's really difficult to find the right community in which to grieve. Here in Western Canada, we have lots of misconceptions about grief, and sometimes we're not very good at grieving, but you are not alone. And my hope and prayer for all of us is that we find a community where we can experience grief and we can learn through it, and we can share what it is, and we can learn and grow in an area that is universal for us all. It could be a mental health professional, it could be a family member, it could be our church, our faith communities, or it could be a place like Pilgrim's Hospice, we dive deep into grief and bereavement at hospice. So I want to talk a little bit to you about Pilgrim's Hospice, and it's already 4. I'll go. I will not keep you too long, but I really want to share a little bit about Pilgrim's Hospice with you. So 148th Street, 98th Avenue, 9808, 148th Street. Beautiful area of the Crestwood neighborhood. So this is a little bit about our history. We were founded in 1994. That is a convent that is beside the Catholic Church, which is called oh my goodness, I'm going to forget the name of it. Any of you know which Catholic church that is? I think it's Our Lady of Assumption, it could be. It's on 148th Street. And there's a convent. Pilgrim's Hospice bought that convent several years ago and operated from that repurposed convent. We basically at that point ran, before I fall off here, I'm going to just step off here so I can see that. We ran community programs and services at that time out of that hospice. We were not a residential hospice. And when we first opened up, we ran adult grief and bereavement programs out of there. And we ran a adult day program out of that convent. We also had a program called Nobody Dies Alone, where we would go out and support people in the community who were at home with a palliative prognosis. Do I need to stand up here? Oh, I'm too far forward? Oh, okay. Are we good? Okay. Maybe I was waving it around too much as well, too. Our vision was always to have a residential hospice. So let's go to the next slide. And these are our founders, Dr. Helen Hayes and Marion Boyd. And these two women just had this vision. And they were relentless in trying to get a hospice in Edmonton. And again, they started this whole program out of the convent, but the convent was never a residential hospice. Okay? So I just want to back up a little bit. Hospice is a place where people come to spend the last days of their life. To come into hospice, you have no other treatment options available to you. You have what is called a palliative diagnosis. So there's no more treatment, and hospice is all about keeping you socially, emotionally, spiritually, physically comfortable at the end of life. Hospice is, well, I think that we can go on. Okay, there's Helen Hayes and Marion Boyd, our founders. That's a recent picture of them too. So core purpose. Really, what we are all about is making end of life a better experience for all. Making end of life. So it's celebrating that end of life. What can we do to help our people in our community experience a good death? Our mission statement says, Pilgrim's Hospice provides supportive and compassionate, family-centered care to enhance the quality and dignity of life for those who are diagnosed with a progressive life-threatening illness, as well as supporting those who are grieving. So our philosophy is very much to take care of the whole family unit, whatever that family unit looks like. Sometimes it's not family. Can you see that? Am I in the way? Sometimes it's not family. Sometimes it's a circle of friends. You know what? We have no distinct vision of what that circle will look like. The vision that Pilgrim's Hospice lives by is any person in Edmonton and surrounding area can access calm and compassionate care at end of life, or as a survivor or loved one, find help with transition caused by death. So Pilgrim's Hospice does not just take care of people to the point of death, but we are committed to the grief process after for those who are surviving that person's death. Here's our values. I'm just going to whip through them. I mean, we value respect and excellence, collaboration, service, and integrity. We work very closely with different community agencies. We offer a respectful community in that every life matters. It does not matter who you are, where you've come from, what your background is, what your culture, religion, sexual orientation, it doesn't matter. Everybody is respected as they come in the doors of Pilgrim's Hospice. And we will always work very transparently. We have just open and honest conversations. The minute that you walk in the door, you know what? We're just going to have a conversation with you. And we really value that integrity and fairness in the way that we operate at Pilgrim's Hospice. We care for the whole person, and that whole person not just being person-centered, but who is involved in your life. The next one is just a few of our organizational highlights. Really, hospice is all about volunteers. We have a very, very robust group of volunteers. We have over 100 volunteers that are incredibly well trained. Everybody goes through a training, and then there are certain areas that they can train in. They can train in grief and bereavement. They can train in spiritual care. We have gardeners and food servers, but everyone has the same training and then specialized training. We offer training for child and teen as well too. Part of our programming right now is child, teen, and family programming. So we train our volunteers very well in that area. We're a registered charity, so Pilgrim's Hospice is not associated with Alberta Health Services or Covenant Health. Pilgrim's Hospice is solely funded through private donations and people in the community. Now, we do receive some money from Alberta Health, which is different from Alberta Health Services. We also receive some money from Alberta Health Services, and we run a day program. Day program is for people in the community to come. They don't have to be living with a palliative diagnosis. Some of them have early onset dementia or different prognosis or different things that make them able to come to our adult day program. And we do receive some funding for that. We have significant donations that allow us to build this beautiful new building that you're going to see in a minute that opened 2 years ago. We're volunteer-supported, AHS-funded hospice day program or adult day program. And all of the programs at Pilgrim's Hospice are provided no cost at all. When people come to the day program, they pay $10 a day, and it's for a whole day program, and they have lunch. But that is just, and we receive some of that money from Alberta Health Service. But the hospice program is no cost at all. Oh, you can't see that very well. Sorry. I'll show you the next slide. Here's a picture of our beautiful building. There we are. That's the Rusin Family Hospice Center, and it is Edmonton's first freestanding residential community hospice. So you might know there are hospice beds available at a few of our different organizations in Edmonton, the Grey Nuns Hospital and St. Joe's and the General Hospital, but this is Edmonton's freestanding community hospice. It's beautiful, and it's going to be just about 2 years now, so it's opened. In that hospice, there are 12 residential there's 12 suites. So at any one time, we have 12 people at end of life. It's got a beautiful courtyard. The rooms are beautiful. We have a Red Seal chef that cooks all the food, and many staff. We've got some of the best young doctors, I think, in Edmonton, amazing nurses, and we have a family life liaison person who deals with all of our families to ensure that all of the needs of our residents and their families are met. There's our hospice. You know what? We just really believe this whole philosophy of hospice, which is run by a board. We have a CEO, and there's about 80 people that work at Pilgrim's Hospice. We believe that the quality of life should not just include living, but as well dying. The next slide just says most people would prefer to die at home. People often want, they say that, I want to die at home. 60% of people actually don't. Who want to die at home, they don't. They end up being transferred to a hospital. Hospice is sort of the answer to that. And I'm going to tell you how do you get into hospice. The next slide just says, we also really believe that families really need a place to grieve. Because again, we're kind of a death-defying culture, and sometimes we don't just provide that space. And that's what hospice does, is provides a place for our families and our residents to grieve. The next one is we really believe that people want to die at home. And so they want to die at home. Hospice becomes their home. And we call it our house. And for our residents that move in, that's their home. They bring their pictures, they bring their pets if they want to. Pets can't stay overnight, but they bring their own, if they want to bring their own blankets, and they can. We work there, and that is their home at that point. Next slide, I'm just going to tell you just a little bit more about this. There was lots of research that went into building this hospice, so it's very purposefully built. It's a home-like environment. We have dining room, we've got little lounge areas everywhere. It has a beautiful courtyard that many people spend, some people even die out in the courtyard if that's their choice. It's beautiful. Individual climate control in each one of the rooms. There's beautiful lighting. Our spa room is lovely. We have a hub of support right from diagnosis through death and through bereavement. And we have integrated, or what we call wraparound services. We have pet therapy and the Threshold Choir, and we have people that come in and do different therapies. Anybody, as far as spiritual care, we invite clergy to come in. If there's someone in your faith tradition that you would like to come in, they're welcome to come in. And if there's no one in your faith tradition, but you're pondering spiritual questions, well, then that's where I serve our residents as well. Next slide. I think that this is just an example. Our beds are beautiful. We have these lovely beds that they expand so they can be like a family bed. So, sometimes 2 or 3 people are snuggled up in the bed, and they're beautiful. They're, and the room, that's just one of our lounges that opens up onto the courtyard. That's our adult day program room. They have so many fun things that go on in there. And our residents who are in hospice can go downstairs and join the adult day program if they're feeling well and are able to do that. We'll just go to the next slide real quickly. There's a lot of writing on there, and it just gives a little bit of the history. In 2017, we were given a $3 million commitment that really sort of kicked off the whole campaign. There was lots of building campaign programs that happened, and in the fall of 2021, we started hiring our nurses, and there's 5 doctors that work there on a rotation. And I think it was September. September was our first resident that came in. October 2021, we had 18 admissions, and 20 people passed that month in hospice. December 2021, I'm sorry, I don't quite have the latest in there, but 133 residents were cared for. Average length of stay, 22 days. Some people are there for longer than that, and some people are only with us for a day or 2 before they pass. It's a beautiful place. I'm so thrilled to be part of the organization. My role as the manager is to build and help to understand what the community needs, build, and then offer grief programs. And we have men's group, we have partner loss, we have intro to grief, we have an 8-week grief program, and we have a child, teen, and family program as well. Perfect question. Can anyone apply for it? Yes, our programs are free to anyone in the community. And if you just go to the next slide, pilgrimshospice.com is our website. There's an email address on there, griefsupport@pilgrimshospice.com. I also have my card with me. Anyone can access those programs. You come to an information session, and we get everyone to come to Introductory to Grief. We do not currently offer any individual support to people who have not come through Pilgrim's Hospice. If you want to access individual support, we send you to some other agencies. But right now we're only offering that individual support to our residents and families who have come through. I just quickly want to say, how would I get to Pilgrim's Hospice if you have a loved one who has a terminal diagnosis? Again, that website, and there is an email that you can access. You simply send an email. We have one full-time person that works 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, just answering questions and helping you figure out the process. There's no one that we will not consider to come to hospice.
Thank you very much, Jill. And on behalf of Thanks, Jill. On behalf of Holy Spirit, we're really happy you could join us today. And so thank you. And just so all of you know, part of your registration is we're going to give an honorarium to the Pilgrim's Hospice Society. So there you go. And I think just in closing, Pastor Lindsay, were you doing a bit of a closing? I think that's what the plan, that the pastors were doing that. So thank you.
Well, we're certainly grateful for this time, often talking end of life, and these important conversations can feel heavy, but they're also life-giving and a way to care for people that we hold in our hearts and that we call beloved. And it's a way for us to look after ourselves and those we love even after we're in God's hands when we die. And so I'm thankful for this time to be together. And so I'll close with a prayer honoring our journey so far today. I know some of us will be returning in October to continue that journey, but no, Pastor Trish and I are here. If today something was brought up for you that you'd like to talk more about, or you want to help plan that funeral service, or just have some more conversation, we're always here. And many of our presenters would love to connect with you further as you heard today. So let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of life. We give you thanks for the ability to love one another. And even though it is difficult, we give you thanks for the love in grief's form that continues when those that we deeply care for have passed on into your care. And so we ask you go with us today as we have pondered these moments for ourselves and those we care about, for the ways that we can plan ahead, for the ways that we can honor your promises for our life, that you hold us completely in all whom you have created. And we ask your blessing upon us as we continue to journey on our life here today. Bless each one whom we love and grant us good rest this evening. All this we pray in your name. Amen. Thanks so much for coming.